Hey everybody, Brian Allred, teaching pastor, New Life Presbyterian Church, and welcome back to Learning to Love Leviticus. And I hope that you are indeed learning to love the book of Leviticus. And if you're not learning to love the book of Leviticus, then at least you're learning that it shouldn't be ignored, that there are riches to be mined in this book of Leviticus. And today we are going to pick back up considering the instructions that we read about in the Holiness Code. A couple lessons ago, we talked about how the Holiness Code is that part of the book of Leviticus with instructions from chapter 17 all the way to chapter 26, almost to the end of the book. We looked at the Holiness Code kind of overall a couple lessons ago. The last lesson we looked at the Holiness Code and its restrictions on the use of blood in chapter 17. And today, in today's lesson, we're going to be looking at chapter 18, which has to do with boundaries in sexual relationships. Boundaries in sexual relationships, Leviticus chapter 18. And so, of course, it's not surprising that this topic has generated a lot of debate in contemporary circles, and it's generated a lot of criticism from groups that are opposed to traditional views of sexual ethics, and specifically those who are opposed to biblical views of sexual ethics. There are opponents that regard biblical sexual ethics as discriminatory against certain groups. We hear this phrase, being on the wrong side of history. And there's this idea that those who hold to traditional or biblical sexual ethics will be on the wrong side of history or already are on the wrong side of history. Of course, it's a very, very narrow view to be taken even globally today. But there are those criticisms and concerns, and some simply just view these boundaries and a biblical view of sexual ethics as outdated. Now, of course, this idea of being outdated is a fair question because we've already seen that a number of the laws that are set forth in the book of Leviticus are no longer binding today upon Christians. And so it's a fair question to ask whether what we read about in Leviticus 18 and the boundaries that the Lord sets in place are actually still in force. And we'll have an occasion to examine that and look at that hopefully in subsequent lessons. But we're going to look at something else today about these boundaries in sexual relationships and how they get set and the attitudes that people have about sexual boundaries. But before getting into that, just I want us to see the connection between chapter 17 and chapter 18 in Leviticus. Remember that chapter 17 had to do with the regulations and restrictions on the use of blood among the covenant people. But we also talked about in the last lesson how the overarching concern of the chapter 17, is the sanctity of life and the purity of worship. And whenever those things diminish in their influence, in other words, when we no longer have a high regard for the sanctity of life, when we no longer have a high regard for those created in God's image, we begin to use people. And of course, it doesn't take long before that use, misuse, and abuse is translated into the sexual realm, where we begin to use people sexually and abuse people sexually. When we have a low regard for the sanctity of life, that is the outcome of sexual union in the conception of children. And when we begin to have a low view of the purity of worship, then when those things erode, life becomes disconnected from God's design. And when it creeps into us as God's people, when we don't uphold the sanctity of life and the purity of our worship, then we begin to live like and look like just the world that's around us, that's God rejecting and God denying. And so that's particularly true in areas of sexual ethics because we live in a climate today where many seem to act as if the freedom of sexual expression is ultimate, that nothing and no one, not God, not the government, not any individual, not any organization, should be able to limit the expression of sexual freedom. And that's kind of the view that is around us. And so when we lose a high regard for the sanctity of life and the purity of worship, we begin to absorb or adopt some of those kinds of attitudes. And it's important for us to push back against those biblically and be conscious of that. Because the interesting thing is, as valued as sexual freedom is in our broader culture, and again, it's almost viewed as ultimate in some circles, in many circles, if not most circles, that it's interesting that very, very few people actually hold to limitless freedom of sexual expression. Very few people actually, in the end, advocate that. Where the differences come in is, how do we identify those boundaries? What exactly are the boundaries? Where are they in place? And how do we come to know where boundaries are in sexual relationships? Where, in other words, when you think about boundaries, what boundaries should not be transgressed? Where are the limits of, of sexual expression? And again, hardly anyone, very, very few people that you will encounter believe that there are no limits that can be transgressed when it comes to sexual expression. Almost everyone believes that there are some boundaries. Question becomes, what are they, and how do we come to identify them? Well, a very common boundary, perhaps the most common one, is that sexual activity should be between two consenting adults. That's the boundary. That if you don't have two consenting adults, then there's some kind of, if not moral transgression, a societal transgression, or there ought to be a personal transgression. That's part of the difficulty with moral relativism, is how do you determine this for other people? But even though we may live in a culture that advocates moral relativism verbally, no one actually lives that out, because we don't really care if someone thinks that rape or sexually molesting young children is okay. Societally and culturally, we believe that there's a transcendent principle that's violated in that. But notice that with rape and sexual molestation of children, that this boundary of two consenting adults is violated. In the case of sexually molesting children, the adult is absent. And in the case of a rape victim, the consent is absent. And so actually, I happen to believe that this is one of the boundaries of proper sexual expression, and that is, it should be only between two consenting adults. I just don't happen to believe that that's the only boundary that's set up. Certainly, I don't believe that scripturally, but I don't believe most people even think that that's the only boundary, and we'll get into that in a second. Most people don't believe that the only boundary is two consenting adults. In other words, in every instance where you have two consenting adults, people should be free to do sexually with whomever they want and do whatever they want. Most people don't believe that, even with two consenting adults. But part of the problem even here is that identifying a valid consent from an adult is more complex than we would think. For example, the age of consent actually varies from state to state. So not even all the states in our country agree with what a valid consent is, what constitutes a consenting adult, let alone globally what that would be. But most states range between the ages of 16 to 18 as those who are considered able to render sexual consent, but it's changed over time. As a matter of fact, it was the age of 14 in the state of Georgia up until 1995, which wasn't all that long ago. And in Hawaii, it was 14 years old up until 2001, which was even more recent, just less than 20 years ago. The consent age was 14 years old in Hawaii. And even then, in some states, it would have been 18, 4 more years later before you were actually regarded as someone who could give valid consent. So, and I'm not going to argue for which one of these it ought to be. My only point here is that it's complex to identify two consenting adults. And it's actually changed drastically over time. In 1880, the age of consent was set at 10 or 12 years old in most states, something that we find almost unimaginable today, let alone what it was in Delaware in 1880, which was the age of 7. And so, again, the point here is that it's changed over time. So this idea of what constitutes a consenting adult is not something that we can establish simply historically. And it's really not even something we can establish biologically, because if you're simply going to use the age at which one is capable of sexual reproduction as the age at which consent ought to be regarded as valid, it's going to be lower than 16 years of age. It's actually going to be closer to this 12 years old than it is to 16 years old. And so, and again, in some areas around the country, even, or some areas around the globe today, that kind of is an influential ingredient in determining when someone is able to enter into marriage, enter into sexual activity. It has to do with biology. That doesn't happen to be the case here because there's some differences in how we land on what are the boundaries and how do we come to know what those are. There seems to be a real difficulty in doing that unless we have a transcendent voice who designed sexual activity. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here, but unless we have a transcendent voice who is the designer of sexuality, tell us these boundaries, it's going to be hard for us to come to an agreement on these things. However, I think most people agree that there are boundaries, and one of those boundaries is that sexual activity should be between two consenting adults. But I said before that even those who would advocate this don't actually believe this is the only boundary, because you just have to ask this. If two consenting adults is the only boundary that's in place, why should cousins not be allowed to get married? For that matter, why should siblings not be allowed? I shouldn't even say get married. Why should cousins not be able to freely engage in sexual activity? Why should siblings who are adults, and again, I'm not talking about siblings who are 10 and 8 years old. I'm talking about siblings in their 20s who happen to say they've fallen in love and want to get married. States have restrictions against those kinds of things, but why should those restrictions be there? And now, of course, some people watching this might think, well, that's disgusting to think about incestuous relationships, sexual relationships between parents and grown children, or sexual relationships between siblings in their 20s or 30s or 40s. That shouldn't happen. We think it's disgusting, so we have laws against it. Well, why should whether you happen to think this act is disgusting or not determine what's permissible for other people? I mean, remember that there are people who think that homosexual acts are disgusting, but that doesn't mean that they should be illegalized. Or if it does, then why were they legalized in light of some people thinking those things are disgusting? I mean, it's difficult to simply say, well, we think that's gross, so it's not permissible. That there's a wide range of what people would say is disgusting or not. And so even this is why I said even this idea of two consenting adults is not held by most people who say this is the boundary, because I would imagine most people that say two consenting adults is required would also say, yeah, but sexual activity between siblings is not acceptable sexual behavior and ought to be restricted. And of course, I understand there's reasons there with possible repercussions with conception and congenital diseases and those kinds of things among children who are born to close relatives. But again, I mean, and how much role should the government have in restricting those kinds of things when it comes to people's freedom of sexual expression? You know, it's interesting when you look at Leviticus chapter 18, most people reading it would actually not have a problem with most of the restrictions that are in the chapter. Again, we're not going to take time to read it in these video lessons, but I encourage you to make sure you're reading all of the chapters of Leviticus as we go through them. But if you look at the chapter, you'll recognize that most people aren't going to disagree with most of those restrictions. There's just some of them that people have a major issue with. So, you know, you have to ask the question, why do people have an issue with the ones that they have an issue with? What accounts for the changes in the views of boundaries that certainly have happened in the West over the last 20 years for sure. I mean, we could go to the last 30 or 40 years for sure, but when it comes to LGBTQ issues, certainly the last 20 or 30 years, some very quick, rapid changes in viewpoints. Why did those happen? But anyway, we'll talk about that at some point later. But here's another thing to think about when you think about boundaries in sexual relationships, and this idea that most people do not hold to limitless freedom of sexual expression, even in our country, where we seem to prize it as almost ultimate. And that's, why do we limit it at two consenting adults? Maybe some of you even picked up on that when I said that sexual activity should be between two consenting adults, but for most people, we don't even think about the specificity of two. Notice I didn't say between consenting adults, but for most of us, there's this default to sexual activity being between two consenting adults. But why is polygamy against the law? Now, I know this has to do with marriage, not just sexual activity, but certainly sexual activity within marriage in polygamy has to do with more than one consenting adult. And of course, states have restrictions on polygamy, marrying more than one person at a time. Why is this the case? And I would argue that it's a reflection of Judeo-biblical sexual ethics, traditional ethics, but we're breaking away from those in so many ways. Sometimes I wonder, where's the person who's advocating for the rights of the polygamist, whether that polygamist is a male or a female, with some of the rhetoric of keeping the government and religious groups out of the bedroom and what people do sexually. Why do we have so few advocates for the rights of the polygamist who it's not an issue of consent? And I recognize it might be, but in issues where it's not, that person, let's say a husband who already has a wife, wants to marry two more wives, they're 32 years old, each of them, and they're consenting to marry this individual. Why is that not legal? Why is that not acceptable? Why is that a transgressed boundary if it happens? Well, it all goes back to traditional sexual ethics and the pattern that's laid down in Genesis, where God created one woman for the man, not two women, not three women, but one woman for the man. That's the pattern. But of course, the argument also touching upon homosexual relationships and same-sex marriages is the pattern is between a man and a woman as well, to be fruitful and multiply and to bring forth children and all those kinds of things. So it gets into, again, some broader arguments. But the only point here is, what are the boundaries? And how do we know what those boundaries are? It's much more complex than just saying two consenting adults, if you have that, anything goes. Most people don't believe that. And of course, what we believe as Christians is that sexual activity and sexual expression are governed by God and His Word. He establishes the boundary. And it's good that He establishes the boundary because He's the one who made us as sexual beings. Derek Tidball says it well when he says, God is not a puritanical killjoy. And by the way, the Puritans weren't killjoys either. But God is not a puritanical killjoy out to prevent His people from enjoying themselves, but rather it's the reverse. As the one who created humans to be sexual beings, He knows the power of the sexual drive and its ability to bring happiness or to breed misery. By the way, if you look at the examples of polygamy in Scripture, multiple marriages, they're always accompanied by misery. Some wonder why the Bible is not more explicit in condemning polygamy, but it certainly is implicit in condemning it by portraying the misery that comes about. But anyway, to get back to Tidball, he wants to save his people from experiencing distress and to establish those foundations on which healthy families can be built. Of course, where healthy families are built, healthy societies, healthy nations are preserved as well. So a couple other things Tidball writes about in that section where he has this quote is that being a sexual being is somewhat like having a car where it requires responsibility and maturity to use it well, to be able to handle it, or it will do untold harm, which is true. I mean, you have to handle your sexuality and your sexual expression with responsibility, with discipline, and with maturity, or it will breed misery and harm. Another imagery that Tidball uses is thinking of sexual desire as a powerful river that, unless it's kept within its banks, if it overflows, it does untold destruction on individuals and on societies. And so we want to consider these sexual boundaries laid down in Leviticus chapter 18, but we'll pick that up next time, so hopefully you'll join us then.